I don't think that that really was even a topic, to be honest, Shaun. I think the sense of who was gay was simply not on the table in that way that it has happened in more recent decades. It just wasn't a topic anybody talked about. You might have had a family conversation, a friend, or somebody knew where the gay bar was at, but you just didn't have that sense of this person is potentially gay. There were a few celebrities who dropped a few hints here and there, but that just didn't happen. There weren't any indications of particular role models among celebrities or politicians or anybody else.
It could be said that during that time, you really could feel alone as a gay person.
Yes, yes, and I think that that's a very important point, talking about how you could deal with that isolation, because not everybody had the ability to connect with the bars, and not everybody had the ability to form any sort of social network that was meaningful. And so I think you're talking about real-time loneliness, where people felt isolated, tried to figure out where they could meet other people, but those opportunities were rare, they were sporadic, they were furtive, people didn't exchange names and addresses. You might meet somebody at a cruising spot or even a bar, but it didn't, and it might be fun to be with them, but it didn't necessarily alleviate the loneliness because nobody wanted to share all that information. You never asked anybody's last name.
Wow.
Never asked where they worked. That was not part of the conversation because the decorum was, I'm Joe, and let's have a party.
And that's it.
That's it, yeah.
Kind of explain for viewers that experience.
Shaun, you're putting me on the spot, but I can tell you exactly. My family basically sold their land in Bellevue and bought a farm in eastern Washington. And this happened when I was a senior in high school in 1959. And so then we moved to eastern Washington. It took a long period of time, but we eventually ended up moving to the farm, and I went over to the farm to help that summer of 59. Then I came back to Seattle to go to the University of Washington. And I can tell you exactly when it happened, when I got off the bus. I finally said, I'm here by myself, and now I'm going to figure it out. And I stashed my stuff in the locker at the bus station, 8th and Stewart, good old Greyhound, and I went down to First Avenue, where I'd heard all the stories for all the years, and I knew there was something there that would be exciting and interesting. I didn't know quite what, but sure enough, I figured I got into a couple of dive bars, even though I was underage. People didn't care. There were the dime movie arcades, which were very cruisy, depending on the movie, and all sorts of things, and so that's when I finally said to myself, now you can explore this side of your life with impunity because there's no family nearby, you're on your own, you're in Seattle, and now's the time to check it out. And
how'd you feel?
Oh, delighted. I mean, I immediately met a lot of younger gay men who were in the same cruisy mood and got invited to parties and got invited to stay overnight and had a great time. Well, it was actually very important. First of all, there were gay bars in the city, and they've been here for a very long time, but you had to have some money, and you had to be someone who liked to drink, and I don't know, somehow that wasn't exactly my mood. But the alternative was there were a number of guys who kind of had house parties on an ongoing basis. Every weekend, people would go there who knew them or knew a friend, and so suddenly there'd be big groups, 10, 15, 25 people there, and drinking and having a good time and talking and laughing, and of course everybody smoked cigarettes, everybody, and that was really part of a social network. Today, I think the women's community does a lot of the same thing, and they still do it that way. The men's community, not so much, but it was really critical. Once you got to know 3 or 4 of these people who always had a house full of people on the weekend, that was a lot of fun, because you could inevitably go there. You'd always take some food or, a couple 6-packs of beer, and you think, oh, come on in, and there'd be people kind of scattered all around talking and whatever. But it turned out to be a lot of fun. And in my mind, in those days, it was more enjoyable than the bars. The bars had kind of a funny ritual, and kind of heavy duty. And I wasn't really into the bar scenes in that age. I went to them, but I really wasn't into them as much as I was the house parties. Well, I think it's a really extraordinarily different era in terms of those issues. And I think that most older gay men would echo my sentiments. Once you felt like you had the freedom to explore your sexuality, it was all out there. And there was a certain concern about gonorrhea or syphilis. AIDS did not exist, but those were manageable by the modern pharmaceuticals, either amoxicillin or penicillin, or there was a dozen different, antidotes. And so people were really not concerned in that particular way because you weren't concerned, obviously, about birth control. And so condoms were not used, and people just had lots of sex and all different versions and tried this or tried that. And so in that sense, it was quite a different era. And it was pretty intense because a lot of younger gay men, just like myself, had migrated to the city and were quite determined to figure this out and have some fun. So there was definitely a sense of making up for lost time. We didn't date in high school. We might have had our eye on some younger guy or a teacher, but you couldn't act on that. So when you reached your 20s and you're finally in the big city, whether it was Seattle or San Francisco or New York, wherever it was, there was definitely a sense of, hey, let's get it on the party going and have a lot of fun. And there really wasn't any grave concern about STDs per se. And if something did happen and some guy had the clap or gonorrhea, it was a fairly simple matter to go to a clinic or a doctor and get the antibiotics to cure it. And it was pretty nonchalant, actually. I think there was probably some problems in some neighborhoods, but the communication links weren't there. You didn't hear about them. If you were kind of cautious and didn't crawl around late at night all by yourself, I think you kind of felt like, well, the world is okay. I had the benefit of being 6'2" and in great shape in those days, and so people didn't mess with me intrinsically. And I think that is an issue. Later, one of my long-term relationships with a fellow named Michael, who was much smaller than me, kept saying over and over again, nobody ever messes with you. And during our relationship, he got beaten up a couple times. So I think that my sense of personal safety was bolstered by a kind of a sense of, well, nobody's going to mess with me. And I had the ability to put on quite a bit of attitude as well. I think I inherited that from my father. But anyway, the point is that I think there were issues, but I can't really talk to them because I just wasn't tuned to what might be happening. But I suspect that if you go back to that era and can find some documentation, you would find that there were regular problems in some neighborhoods, and that the fag bashing that we talk about in later eras was actually fairly prevalent in that era as well. But I don't know how you can document that.
Most men back then, to my understanding, used not their real name. Yes. They would use a fake name or a nickname. So when you were in college and you were chasing around, did you go by your real name?
Yes, but you never shared your last name. So I was always George. Sometimes I was Rudy. My full name is Rudolph George. Depending upon my mood, I was either Rudy or George. And I think the nomenclature of the day was more your appearance, where you hung out, those things, and then the name, the first name.
What was some of the slang? Like, did you refer to yourselves as homosexuals, queers? Now, we have all this stuff around language, but it must have been easy going back then.
That's a good question. Somehow it wasn't as topical as you might think. There were lots of jokes calling each other Mary was a phrase for, oh, Mary, and the word queen came up because drag queens were prevalent as well. And but the word gay crept in a little bit later. I don't think I ever heard anybody talk about being a homo or use the word homosexual. That maybe comes along a little bit later on. Queer was actually an inside term that you could use carefully, but it was a very vicious term in terms of the straight society because it was always the attack language. and negative, and but you could teasingly talk about being queer with some of your friends during that era. But I don't remember ever really having much of a conversation about the nomenclature, because I think it was kind of a secretive society sort of approach. We know each other, we know where to go, we know how to do this, but it's all very insular and very contained. And so I think these names and words that we're talking about today came along later, when as a community we decided it's time to identify, be more open, and start putting out information about the community to other people. We understood it, but we didn't need to have anybody else understood it. And there was some fear and danger in that. People could lose their jobs, could be kicked out of their homes, churches would shun you. There was all sorts of negatives. If you were outed inappropriately, you really could pay a high price. And I don't know that people here today, or the younger kids, understand all these negatives that would suddenly become part of your life. Family throwing you out, church saying we don't want you, you get fired, your landlord won't let you live there anymore. Your life could be destroyed in a matter of days if for some reason everybody thought you're this undesirable gay, homosexual person. There were a couple of early community centers. I actually spent some time in one of them that was downstairs right off of Pioneer Square. There was a couple of the missions that were actually pretty accepting of gay men who were desperate for help, as long as you didn't identify as gay. You just were quietly in line to have food. But there really were not resources comparable to today. It was kind of funny because the community center was actually very straight-laced. They'd have these dances, and there was absolutely no kissing or no, hardcore sort of was allowed. You had to kind of play it really, really cool, like you're at a high school dance. I always thought that was kind of funny. But there really weren't the resources that we think of today. Those come along a little bit later than those early 50s and 60s eras. There was probably a network that I wasn't connected to that represented people who hung out in the bars and knew each other pretty well. I think it's important that we mention that the bars have always been a very important nexus for sociability and cruising and just plain getting away from the ordinary life, go somewhere to have a drink. But there's a bonding effect for people who are regulars, and they begin to care and share about each other. Interesting enough, as the AIDS epidemic came along, the reason I mention this is virtually every bar in the city had their own helping project to people who were sick. And that didn't happen just overnight. It happened because that tradition already existed. You hang out with this group of guys, you get to know them, and if they're having a problem, then you help them out. You have a support network that is intrinsic in that collection of people who see each other often at a bar. And when the AIDS epidemic came along, that became an essential part of the response, because every bar had some sort of project, raising money, helping people pay their rent, taking care of them when they were at home, doing their laundry, all that sort of thing. And so I've always thought about, well, that didn't happen overnight. That happened because those bars were already in that mode to help out people who needed some help. And I don't think we've really given credit enough to that sense of the gay bars, particularly in this city. Pioneer Square was very derelict, had been virtually abandoned as the old neighborhood. Remember, Pioneer Square goes back to like 1890, turn of the century, and the city had moved north and rebuilt, and there were modern buildings and modern shopping opportunities. And so Pioneer Square had just been kind of virtually abandoned. And so there were some dive bars, and there was a number of derelict folks, the drifters, and what we would call today the homeless, and the missions, and the gay bars. That's what Pioneer Square consisted of. And there were actually quite a collection of them. I can't name them all, but they would come and go. People would find the space, and they would rent it and clean it up and open up. And then, 6 months later, somebody else would take it over and change the name or whatever. They kind of came and went in a regular pattern, but the sum total is that there were 8 or 10 operating bars there every weekend. And so it was really a party zone. It was Pike Pine Quarter today, but at a much smaller scale. So you started in one bar, whatever it was, you had a drink, and then you went to the next bar, and then the next bar, and it was really a party zone that was virtually devoid of a lot of people, except people there to go to the gay bars. And in that way, it created some safety, but also the ability to socialize with a much larger circle of people. I'd say a large number of them, because that was the cover for their lives, to go ahead and form a relationship and then get out of the house on a weekend night. I think the assumption that there were lots of married men there was probably correct. It was regional. People came from all the smaller towns around Seattle, and in the neighborhoods, you met people. A lot of people lived on Queen Anne and Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill rents were dirt cheap back then, and Capitol Hill had always been the cheap apartment for the working force that worked downtown. So even then, Capitol Hill had lots of gay guys living on it because you could rent these apartments that were very, very decent for virtually nothing.
Can you give an example of the price?
$75 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. I mean, this isn't $1970. Yeah, exactly.
And what were the prices in the bar? Let's say you went to a gay bar. It'd be per nowadays, but you go to a lounge. What was the price?
Well, lots of 50-cent drinks, 75-cent drinks, $1 drinks. You could buy dinner and have drinks for $3. The prices were ridiculous, and happy hour was even more interesting. Dime beers, very common. And in a day when people weren't wealthy, but you still had a few bucks in your pocket, if beer's a dime, you get pretty reckless, Here, I'll buy everybody in the bar a beer. It cost you $2.
You always see those in old movies. Around for everyone.
Yeah,
now.
Yeah, that was at midnight when the beer was a dime.
At midnight when beer was a dime.
Well, it was very checkered. I think one of our historical loss of memory is that somehow the police were helping or were somehow less vicious in Seattle and San Francisco than they really were. The cops did not like gay people. They had free rein to harass you, beat you up, or otherwise mess with you if you were on the streets late at night. And the only reason this culture existed of the bars is because they paid off the cops. The cops were utterly corrupt and took the money openly and let the bars stay open, and then they wouldn't harass the people who were going there. But if the bar wasn't paying off, the cops would park in front of the bar, and then nobody would dare go in the bar because you were trying to be very private and very covert, and obviously if the cops were right there, then you were also scared. They also routinely busted people. There were rules about not wearing feminine apparel and this and that. And if they decided to be mean and vicious about it, they would enforce these rules and just literally harass people. So there was really a very bizarre relationship. The police were not your friend. They were the enemy. They represented the status quo who didn't like you, and you didn't mess with them. But on the other hand, you didn't view them as any resource if there were a crisis or emergency. Staying away from the cops and avoiding any interaction was part of the day's need. And Seattle has some famous stories because a little later the bars decided to quit paying the cops off. And there was a huge number of police that were indicted under a grand jury for taking bribes. And I think that's notable because it's probably the first resistant movement in the city on a major way is when half a dozen bar owners said, we're tired of this, we're going to quit paying off the cops.
And these are gay bar owners?
Yes. And it's very historic, it's documented. A new prosecutor named Bailey came along, and they indicted 56 people, if I remember the number correctly, including high-ranking officers. The police chief resigned. It was a huge scandal. But it was probably the first real fight back of a community sense from the gay community was when the bar owners said, we're not paying off the cops anymore. Now, this payoff that I'm talking about wasn't nickels and dimes. It was a huge amount of their gross. Some guy shows up for their $75 every Monday morning, and then they would distribute it among the various police departments and the beat cops. So we got some, and everybody would get a few bucks. But you had this rip-off going from 10 or 15 or 20 places every week, and so it amounted to quite a bit of money in the terms of those days.
Then you're talking about nickel beer.
Yeah, exactly. So that was part of it. I'm sure that the bar owners finally began saying, my God, we can't afford to do this and operate a legitimate business. We can't give all this gravy off the top to the police department as a payoff. But I think maybe there was also a resistance movement building. People were beginning to think that there was a future. You could be gay and live in Seattle And so maybe there's also, and I can't document this personally because I wasn't involved in any of those episodes, but my personal opinion is that there was also this growing sense of we can come together as a community and do something good for ourselves. It's a very healthy signal, in my opinion, to what comes later on.